I would say I had not seen the Iraq War really change American politics and culture, or had seen how much disdain for the Iraq War had changed American politics and culture until the rise of Trump. Because when Trump rose, my sense of the American sort of public's view of it was that Democrats had soured on it, because no one should say Democrats initially opposed it. There were probably a higher percentage of Democrats who initially opposed it than Republicans, but there was strong bipartisan support for the Iraq War. Let's just make that clear. There was very strong congressional majorities who authorized it. This was something that leaders in the Democratic and Republican Party had supported. And there was, yes, a vocal opposition, but it was a minority opposition. And my general view is that by 2016, things had kind of broken down along partisan lines, with Republicans, to the extent that they had frustration with it. It was more with execution, that there had been blunders that had made the war more difficult than it should have been, especially the post-invasion phase of the war, much more difficult than it should have been, but that it was still worth fighting, and Democrats who had turned decisively against it. And Trump comes in and he runs like he belongs to Code Pink, and which was disingenuous. I mean, there was no real evidence that he had been some sort of vocal opponent of the war before. And I don't know if he so much tapped into something that already existed, or he had tapped into some sort of underlying anti-establishment anger, and that however he directed it, his people would buy into it, which also I think is part of it. But he definitely tapped into an underlying sense of anger about the war that I did not know existed in the GOP, that, I'll be completely frank, I had not seen. And then it started to create a culture, even within the GOP, that if you supported the Iraq War, you were a part of the problem. You were going to be furiously attacked, that there was no real argument for it. It was the consensus that all right-thinking people now agree it wasn't right. And I don't think that everyone told rank and file Republicans that completely. It was an interesting, I believe it was the Axios poll recently that showed that there's still pretty strong Republican support for the invasion, which was fascinating to me given the last 7 years of rhetoric from Trump. I'm going to be, let me put on a predictive cap, and I'm going to think in 20 years, you're going to start to see some interesting reappraisals from the consensus now that it was all just a terrible mistake. I still support it. I still think it was the right decision. I believe that there were problems with execution, but it has become such a political hot potato, even on the right as well, that I don't, honestly, 20 years from now, 20 years on, at this 20-year anniversary, I still don't know if we're able to look at it from a sort of a sense of historical, professional historical detachment, if that makes sense.
Well, Steve, I was going to ask you a different question, but now I just want to hear your response to what David just said.
So much there. So I was a very strong supporter of the Iraq War. I wrote a book about Saddam Hussein's support for Islamic terrorism, including Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And I thought that among the arguments to go to war, that was one of the strongest, given what we'd seen, the attacks we'd seen on the homeland on 9/11, and Saddam's history through the 1990s of both building a weapons of mass destruction program and aggressive external behavior. I think one point that David made that I agree with entirely, and I think doesn't get nearly enough attention, it is really important to remember that there was a very broad bipartisan consensus to go to war. If you look back at the speeches, this is October 8th and 9th of 2002, the Senate floor speeches made by the most outspoken opponents of the war, many of them cited things like the presence of Saddam's WMD program in their arguments against going to war in Iraq. Ted Kennedy, one of the leading opponents of the war, gave a speech in which he talked about the threats to U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops, if we sent them into theater because we knew Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Hillary Clinton, in her speech, made an argument about Saddam's history of support for jihadists and Islamic extremists. So there was a broad consensus. This was not the Bush administration lying the country into war. There was a consensus view, particularly on weapons of mass destruction, that he had the stuff and that he was the threat. Now there were differences.
Just to push back on that for
Sure.
1 second, wouldn't their response be, yeah, it was the consensus view because we were all getting briefings that were not right?
Correct. Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, look, if you want to go back to your original question, what's the sort of lasting impact of this? I think probably the first thing I thought of when you said that was this was yet another in a long string of incidents, and maybe the most significant in eroding the sense of trust that the American people have in institutions broadly, right? And that came with good reason. It turned out, I mean, if you go back and you read Bob Woodward's books, the number of sources that we had, especially in human intelligence collection on Iraq's WMD program, but in particular on Iraq's support for terrorism, were minimal. At one point, Woodward quotes somebody who was a leader in the CIA's effort to collect against the Iraqi target. And this person, and Woodward says, how many people did we have on the ground looking at Iraq and its support for terrorism? And this person says, I can count them on one hand and still pick my nose. So we made all of these decisions with a very flimsy, I would say, record of what was actually going on at the time the decisions are made. Now, that's separate from the long history of what we'd seen from Saddam, going back to the Gulf War, going back before the Gulf War. We know he had these weapons of mass destruction. We know he was aggressive in supporting all kinds of terrorists. He housed terrorists. He gave safe haven to terrorists in the country. He supported them well beyond the country. Some of the things that we found out after the war was that he was paying Ayman al-Zawahiri, his Egyptian Islamic Jihad, for years. Ayman al-Zawahiri was Osama bin Laden's number two. Saddam Hussein was making regular payments to Osama bin Laden's number two. He was funding al-Qaeda affiliates in places like the Philippines and Africa, what have you. So on the question of whether Saddam Hussein and Iraq posed the threat that we thought he posed at this point 20 years ago, I think the answer is no. He didn't have the weapons of mass destruction that we thought he had. The Dulfer report, which studied this, made, I think, a convincing and compelling case that he would have reconstituted those programs the second the pressure was off of him, but he didn't have them the way that we had them. I guess my biggest problem with the way that the war unfolded was in its execution. I think there was a good reason to believe from the beginning, from the initial surge into the country, that we didn't have enough troops, that we couldn't control the ground. And the administration, I think the Pentagon under Donald Rumsfeld, was slow to realize that fact, very slow to realize that fact, and took years to overcome that fact. I think it created a lot of problems. There were all sorts of, I think, more specific problems with the execution of the war. But in the big picture, the Axios poll that David cited was so interesting because it was the case that the 60%, 6 in 10 Republicans said the U.S. was right to invade. I was surprised that 1 in 4 Democrats still today says the U.S. was right to invade. But you've read a lot or heard a lot this week about how it's cast this long shadow over U.S. foreign policy making, and it's made the conventional wisdom has made the Republican Party in particular much more reluctant to have the U.S. take this leading role on the world stage. And if that's true, it doesn't show up in this poll. 79% of Republicans say the U.S. should continue to be the global leader. And a huge majority of Republicans, I'm quoting here, 88% opposed the U.S. reducing military and national security spending. So, as you've read for the past week about this new dovish, non-interventionist Republican Party, it sets aside polling results like that. And I think we're unwise to do that.
Jonah, one of the watershed moments in modern American history is the 1-2 punch of the Vietnam War and Watergate. And I mean, there's any manner of things you can look at in the last 50 years, and people will say, but remember, this is coming out of those post-Vietnam Watergate years, and that's why the American people X, Y, or Z. And I wonder if the Iraq War tied together with the 2008 financial crisis really can account for a lot of our, at least last 7 years or so of politics. And I'm wondering what you think of that comparison.
No, I think that's a very good comparison. And we've been talking here many times about the long tail of populist reactions to financial crises. And I think the coming on the heels of the Iraq War, and also just the election of Barack Obama, which was its own sort of moved the Overton window in all sorts of ways. I think is going to be remembered. I mean, I hate the phrase of inflection point. I really hate it. But it's going to be remembered as something like an inflection point in American history.
I guess part of the question is, we know the 2008 financial crisis had a huge impact. How much of that, though, was the sort of 1-2 aspect with the Iraq War and that sort of, as Steve points out, this trust in institutions, that the national security apparatus, somewhere between lied and screwed up, right? There's no like good version. And that once again, these so-called experts didn't get it right, and this cost lives. And I feel like it was why people were so quick during COVID to say, don't trust the experts, is time and again, whether again, you look back at Vietnam or Iraq or then COVID, this idea that like, you just have to go with the experts because they're the experts. There was no built up sense that like, no, just no.
No, look, I agree with that. And I think there are other threads that connect some of these things. I mean, I'm thinking about, I didn't mean to make it sound like Barack Obama's election was a disaster or anything like that, but under Barack Obama, let's put it this way, under George W. Bush, you had all sorts of assurances from experts about WMDs, about how to be a cakewalk and how, they'll be graded as liberators and all these things, which were actually a small part of a lot of people's arguments, but they're the ones that got boosted. And in fact, the whole emphasis on WMD, as Paul Wolfowitz admitted it in an interview with Sam Tannenhouse that got blown out of proportion, was because it wasn't that it was the best or only reason to go into Iraq. It was the one reason that united all the different factions of the American foreign policy establishment. And so that was the one they settled on, which I think was a blunder. But you had Barack Obama and the administration constantly invoking its own expertise, saying those other experts couldn't be trusted because they were all liars and partisans, but we're the real dispassionate, pragmatic, objective, disinterested experts. And that's why we can promise you there will be shovel-ready jobs, right? And then there are no shovel-ready jobs, and that the stimulus will get us out of this recession, and it didn't get us out of the recession. And so I think you have these multiplier effects of distrust that you keep going to the next example of something, and oh crap, these experts aren't trustworthy either. And I think the big takeaway from everything that you guys have been saying for me is how important leadership is, because including negative leadership. Right. So an enormous number of Democrats, I think very cynically, as Stephen was kind of alluding to, said Bush lied us into war. Now, those Democrats voted in favor of the war based upon, as Sarah was pointing out, the same intelligence briefings that the Bush administration had. So where did the lie come in? Right. And but it was a very cynical way of saying, oh, I was misled by them to vote wrong, even though I know for a fact that Bush wasn't lying. You can argue that they were wrong. That's a perfectly legitimate argument to make. But you can't say that Bush and Cheney and that entire apparatus knew that the intel was wrong and did it anyway, right? And so the popularization of this lied us into war thing was really, really immoral leadership by Democrats. It was throwing the credibility of the government itself under the bus for political expediency. And you multiply that, or you add to that, Donald Trump coming in. We've been talking about how a lot of Democrats were in favor of the war, and then they just changed their positions and pretended, that they were lied to and all that. I'm angrier at this stage at a lot of my former, conservative and Republican friends who were much more rah-rah for the war than I was, who are now pretending that they were always, Lindberghs on this, and that they were part of the America First Committee, and they're like, how dare you try to, impose your values on Iraq and all these kinds of things. Like, I remember, people like Victor Davis Hanson being much more bought into the freedom agenda than I was. And now there's this whole sort of I'm a skeptic. I've always been a skeptic of American foreign power, power projection and all the rest. And Donald Trump gave a lot of people permission to do that. And I don't think he had to do it. He could have, I don't think there was this huge wellspring of hatred for Bush's, for Jeb or W when he ran in 2015. But the fact that he was willing to go there, he kind of created this environment where it was kind of fun to crap on the Bushes, and it took on a life of its own. Similarly, I think he created this environment where it was proof that you were willing to take on the establishment by saying you were always against the Iraq war. Leadership matters. And that's one of the reasons why I think you can get you can get out of a lot of these mistakes by actually modeling the right kind of behavior. But one of the things you have to do is not think that the most important constituency in life are your 10,000 most ardent Twitter followers.
Wait, can I jump in real fast on the war itself, the justification for the war itself? There's a lot of revisionist history there that's all connected with the Bush lied, people died argument. Look, there were a layer of reasons why we did this. I mean, reason after reason after reason after reason, up to and including Saddam Hussein was destabilizing the Middle East. He was one of the principal financial supporters of the Second Intifada that was destabilizing Israel and was horrific. He hatched a plot to try to kill an American president, former President George H.W. Bush. His forces were shooting at American pilots almost on a daily basis. He was a supporter of international terrorism. He was periodically menacing neighbors that he'd invaded previously and was periodically menacing them again. And then on the WMD front, a lot of people forget that among the people deceived by the WMD issue, there's a lot of evidence that those people included Saddam Hussein, who believed he had a more viable chemical weapons arsenal than he really did. And in fact, we did find a lot of chemical weapons in Iraq. There's a New York Times report from 2014 that's one of the more valuable correctives to the record that I've ever read, that everyone's forgotten about. But when I was there, we were finding chemical weapons in country. That was something that was happening when I was there. Now, they weren't the ready to use stocks that we thought existed. That is absolutely correct. But this idea that Iraq was a chemical weapons free zone is just fictional. They were there, just not as we believe them to be. I really like this. And finally, I really like the story. I was talking to a general. This was towards the end of the war, towards the end of phase 1 of the war. And he had expressed anger that America had gone into Iraq in a meeting with Petraeus. And Petraeus said to him, this is, being repeated secondhand to me and later on, but he says, Petraeus said to me, just put on your strategic cap and look at the map of the Middle East, and I'm going to walk out of the room. And when I come back into the room in 5 minutes, you're going to tell me why we're here. That there are a lot of fundamental geostrategic reasons why Saddam Hussein on that spot of the map of the world was particularly dangerous to the United States and the world. And so I don't want to gloss over all of the reasons that existed independently from the WMD story that now pop culture has hatched in as saying was entirely false, which is also not the case. It was not.
Steve, I want to give the last word to you on this. Iraq War, 20 years later, you literally wrote the book. How do you personally feel at the anniversary?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to pick up on what David is saying, if you read everything that has been published over the past week or over the past couple of weeks, collectively, it just our sort of collective remembrance of the war and lessons about what it wrought sort of sets aside what Saddam Hussein was and what he was doing in the years leading up to it. I mean, people have kind of created this fictional account of Saddam sitting quietly in Baghdad, not really messing with anybody, not really doing anything. He was killing his own people to the tune of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, torturing Shiites, the majority population in Iraq, killing the Kurds. He was funding and promoting terrorism in the region and much well beyond the region. And it's hard to overstate the extent to which Bill Clinton's second term in office, this is during the impeachment proceedings and all of the craziness that went with that, how much Bill Clinton was obsessed with the threat from Saddam Hussein. Bill Clinton went to the Pentagon and gave a speech about the greatest threat. It was the greatest threat that the civilized world faces, and that was the possibility of weapons of mass destruction, rogue state actors and non-state actors getting together and creating threats. And I think if you look back at the Iraq War and the decision making in that context, it's the most intellectually honest way to evaluate it. But it also, I think, gives you a sense of why George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and these others felt like they had to do what they did. It's a very different question, though, if you say, knowing what we know now, was it worth it? And, on the one hand, it's sort of too cheap and easy to ask that question because we didn't make the decision knowing everything we know now. But it matters to me, as somebody who was a strong proponent of the war, that we didn't find the stockpiles that we were told were there. I certainly thought they were there. Many Republicans thought they were there. Most Democrats thought they were there. They weren't there. So Saddam, I think it's fair to say, wasn't the immediate threat that we thought he was at the time. And, remember, there was a huge national debate over the meaning of the phrase imminent threat. And sometimes Bush people would say imminent threat, even though they mostly avoided the phrase. But Democrats tried to put it in their mouth. The people who opposed the war would say, well, Saddam isn't an imminent threat, therefore we don't have to do anything about him. I think it can still matter that he was a threat. But when you take away the immediacy of the threat, if he doesn't have these stockpiles, I think the case for war becomes a lot more difficult. And I say that as somebody, Jonah's right. I mean, as a historical matter, it is a fact that the Bush administration settled on the WMD. I mean, it was about 85% of the case that the Bush administration made. If you go and you look at Colin Powell's presentation at the United Nations as a proxy for how they made the case, and I think it was a proxy, it was about 85% of the case that the Bush administration made was on WMDs. I think it was appropriate to make a big case about the WMD threat. It's what we've been dealing with for the past decade, but I don't think it was the only argument for the war. I think they would have been better off making more of a human rights case and making more of a broader threat case, more of a terrorist threat case. But I do think it's, if you look back now, knowing everything that we know now, I don't know that I certainly wouldn't make the same arguments that I made then. I believed Saddam was a threat. I don't believe he was an immediate threat.